Welcome, everyone. I'm Bob Sharf, and on behalf of the Numata Center for Buddhist Studies, I'd like to welcome you all. Before we get on with the main business today, which is the annual awarding of the Toshi Book Prize, I would just like to announce the Jaini Award, which we do every year. The Padmanabh S. Jaini Graduate Student Award in Buddhist Studies was established in 2009 with a generous gift from Professor Jaini that was matched by the Chancellor's matching program. This award supports high-achieving graduate students in Buddhist Studies at Berkeley and honors Professor Jaini's seminal legacy in the field of Buddhist Studies, both at Berkeley and beyond. Professor Jaini, who's now sadly passed, was a co-founder of the group in Buddhist Studies at Berkeley, so we're all very much in his debt. The winner this year is Howard Mu, a PhD candidate in the group in Buddhist Studies. Fortunately for Howard, he's not with us today. Fortunately in that he's pursuing his dissertation research at Kyoto University in Japan. And his dissertation, tentatively titled On the Margins of Mahayana, the Changshilun Tradition in Medieval Chinese Buddhism, is a detailed exploration of Hari Varman's treatise on the establishment of reality, or the Tattva Siddhi Shastra, and its reception in China. So that's it for the Jaini Award. We're very proud of you, Howard. To move now to the Toshihide Numata Award in Buddhist Studies. The award is sponsored by the Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai, and I'd like to introduce Brian Nagata, who is the director of the Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai America and a longstanding friend of our program, to say a few words about BDK and their educational mission. Hi, Brian.
Good afternoon. Sitting here this afternoon, how many of us can envision our dreams, our visions, our efforts 100 years from now? On December 5th, 2125, I think it is safe to say that most of us will be in another realm by then. But it was exactly 100 years ago, right here in Berkeley, that a young Cal student named Eha Numata embarked on a vision, a dream, a wish to share the wisdom and compassion of the Buddha with the world. And since that time, by this year, 2025, his vision includes a world-leading precision instrument manufacturer with branches in more than 50 countries of the world. But this company's primary purpose is to enable the light of the Buddha Dharma to embrace the world. His vision has made possible the distribution of more than 10 million copies of the teaching of Buddha throughout the world in more than 40 languages. And we're continuing his dream to translate the Chinese Tripitaka into English. And of course, all of you are familiar with the extensive network and effort we've invested in the advancement of Buddhist studies through the years, culminating in today's Toshi Award. Thanks to the support and the efforts of Bob Sharf and the Berkeley Center for Buddhist Studies, the Toshi Award is able to recognize the outstanding scholarship of your colleagues and respected Buddhologists. And this year, BDK is most grateful that the Toshi Award has selected our most respected sensei, Colette Cox, for her wonderful book. Thank you, Sensei. Cox Sensei, thank you for your decades of dedicated research, efforts, and insight throughout your wonderful career in the advancement of Buddhist studies in America. You honor us in continuing the vision and dream of Eha Numata. Thank you.
So UC Berkeley's Numata Center for Buddhist Studies administers the Toshihide Numata Book Award on behalf of the Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai. We present the award annually to an outstanding book in the area of Buddhist studies, and the selection is made by an external committee that is appointed anew annually. the members of which are kept strictly secret, and they don't even know who each other are, in fact. The winner this year, as you clearly know, is Colette Cox, Professor Emerita of the University of Washington, for her book, A Gandhari Abhidharma Text, British Library, Kharoshthi Fragment 28, which is volume 8 in the Gandharan Buddhist Text series, published by Washington University Press. Members of this year's committee were extremely enthusiastic about the volume, which represents the fruits of literally decades of labor. One of the reviewers called the volume a landmark contribution to Buddhist studies. Going on, he or she said, the volume's meticulous integration of paleographic, linguistic, and doctrinal analysis marks a new standard in the study of Gandhari Buddhist manuscripts. Another reviewer wrote, it will endure as a foundational study for the early history of Buddhist thought. Now I'm going to say a few words about Colette in a minute when I introduce her to give her keynote, but first I would like to call up Brian to present this year's prize. It comes with a check, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much.
So as I mentioned, Colette is Professor Emerita of Sanskrit and Buddhist Studies at the University of Washington. She completed her BA in religion at Carleton College and then went on to do an MA, MPhil, and PhD at Columbia University. Note that the research for her dissertation was done in the late 90s and early 80s, which is at a time when Abhidharma studies were still, to put it mildly, undeveloped in the West. With the possible exception of Professor Jaini, maybe, it was basically, it was not being done. So Colette conducted her research somewhat accordingly in India and in Japan, working at both Tokyo University and Ryukoku in Kyoto, learning from some of the most renowned Buddhologists of that period, Takasaki Chikido, Kachiyama Yuichi, and so on. Now, early in her career, she published a number of groundbreaking papers on Sarvastivada scholasticism and path theory, and in 1995, her first book, which was a revision of her dissertation, appeared, Disputed Dharmas, Early Buddhist Theories on Existence, an annotated translation of the section on factors dissociated from thought from Sanghabhadra's Nyaya-nusara. Despite the title, it was an instant classic and remains so to this day. It's one of the most robust studies of the mature Vaibhashika system in the English language. It's quite amazing because she went right to the most advanced, the last stage of the kind of development of Sarvastivada Abhidharma, looking at Sanghabhadra's Nyaya-nusara. But then she picked one of the most difficult topics in that that period, the factors dissociated from thought and so on. So she went on to collaborate with her colleague Richard Solomon to build the Buddhist Studies program at the University of Washington, where she had been working since 1985. As such, she was on the scene in 1995 when Richard Solomon was asked to oversee a study of some 28 Buddhist birch bark manuscripts discovered in Afghanistan that had come into the possession of the British Library. The manuscripts in the Gandhari language and in Kharoshthi script turned out to date from the 1st century of the Common Era, making them the earliest surviving manuscripts then known. And Colette joined Richard in overseeing what became known as the Early Buddhist Manuscript Project, and in time other groups of Kharoshthi documents emerged, some of which were dated back even farther, some to the 1st century BCE, I believe, based on carbon dating. And Colette and Richard went on to train an entire generation of scholars who work on these texts and who are now scattered across North America, Australia, Germany, Japan, and so on. And collectively, they have produced a wealth of research on these early texts, which has and continues to revolutionize our understanding of the early history of Buddhism. So the most recent study, which is the book that we're here to celebrate today,
is based on a single manuscript that was among the first 28 that was found, I believe, in Gandhari, written in Kharoshthi script. And it is the only one of its kind of these birch bark manuscripts, being a polemical Abhidharma work, which deals critically with the Sarvastivada claim that everything exists. And it's kind of amazing that it fell into Collett's hands, because she is the perfect person, and I wonder if in fact she's the only person who could have handled this text. Even though it's quite small, it's extraordinarily technical, and it's written in a language that very few people know, and written in a script that very few people can decipher. And Collett had the ability to bring her many talents all to bear on this single text, and produced an amazing 600 pages on 2 pieces of birch bark. I'm sorry for teasing you, Collett, but it's an astounding study, and really does have profound implications for our understanding of early Indian scholasticism. So join me in welcoming Collett, who's going to give a keynote.
Amazing. Well, obviously, Bob, thank you for that introduction. And I'd also like to thank Brian Nagata and the BDK and the Numata Foundation for this book award. It is indeed an honor, an unexpected, I must say completely unexpected on my part, honor. And so I also thank the anonymous committee for seeing something of merit in my book. I'd also like to thank Sanjot Mahendale and Bob for organizing this event today, and for all of the work that you do for the Toshihide Numata Book Award. And to our 3 speakers, right? Fortunately, we have a variety of opinions here. We will have Baba Norihisa, Gao Ming Yuan, and Rupert Geffen also speaking. I thank you for your participation, and I look forward to hearing what you will say. We had a very interesting lunch. I wish you all could have been there, discussing some of the more technical aspects of what they are going to say, but I'm looking forward to it. And thanks also to all of you who are joining us here today. I actually have one more thank you, or it might be better to say an expression of heartfelt appreciation of a special group who made this book possible. And I did the research on the manuscript and the text studied in this book, as Bob mentioned, as part of the Early Buddhist Manuscripts Project, or EBMP, at the University of Washington. Now, I mention this to you because I discovered something extremely important from this experience, namely the power of collaboration. It was the first time I'd really collaborated with other people in a group, and it was absolutely invaluable. And so I would suggest that all of you give this a try, right? Join groups, collaborate, and you will see the benefits that you receive from this. And so I'd also like to thank all of my EBMP colleagues who taught me the power of collaborative work. Now, at least it's a shorter title, right, Bob? So I've learned a little bit, but it is a title that I am going to explain in just a few moments. Those of you who've seen my book know that it is an in-depth study of an early Buddhist text recorded in a birch bark manuscript, written in the Kharoshthi script and in the Gandhari language, and dating from the 1st to 2nd century CE. It's preserved as fragment 28 in the British Library collection, and hence I will refer to both the manuscript and the text as BL 28. And by study here, I mean that the book contains a description of the manuscript, It contains a reconstruction and transcription, or description of the physical condition of the manuscript, a reconstruction and transcription of the text that the manuscript records, and a philological analysis of the script and language. And in addition to that, the book contains a translation and study of the text itself. Perhaps fortunately, at least for most of you here today, I will not discuss the manuscript, and I will not discuss the philological analysis, right? That's as close as I come to a joke. Yeah, you'll appreciate it when I finish all of this. So what will I discuss? I will begin with BL 28 itself, since it provides the context both for much of my recent research and also for my perspective on textual work. But like all manuscripts, and especially manuscripts of very early texts, BL 28 offers perspectives on so many aspects of textual study. And so today I will explore certain specific lessons that can be learned from BL 28, which I will suggest might be or should be applied to our study of other texts as well. So what do these lessons include? The first lesson, and perhaps the key to understanding the importance of the book, is the particular significance of the text recorded in BL 28. All texts in early manuscripts are significant, especially since they provide invaluable evidence of a text preserved as it was when the manuscript was written. They also provide evidence of the historical circumstances of their composition and early transmission, as well as of those teachers and groups who may have been involved in this process. In the case of BL 28, we have a textual witness for a very early polemical exegetical text from the 1st to 2nd century CE, prior to the greater flourishing and regularization of the scholastic genre over the next several centuries. But the remarkable and in fact unique significance of BL 28 actually lies in its particular contents, which discuss a topic that is key to developments in early Indian Buddhist doctrine. And so I think I should at least spend a bit of time talking about that is, its contents today. I'll then turn to the second, more general, and in some ways, perhaps more important lesson that can be learned from BL 28, which is suggested by the phrase, the elusive text, in the title of my presentation. The implications of this phrase, or at least what I intend by it, may not be immediately apparent. But, excuse me. And my comments on this, I will warn you, may be radical or even extreme to many of us. But I will, at least, I'm warning you now, I will present these comments in order to help you to understand why I think it is extremely important to consider certain assumptions before we work on any text. And so, let's turn then to the first lesson to be learned from BL 28, the significance of the text itself. Okay. And as I mentioned, we have here the earliest unrevised textual witness of a Buddhist polemical scholastic treatise. I could say that 4 or 5 more times. It's extremely important. We have a slide here and images of the manuscript fragments that form BL 28. There are 2 fragments. The images on the extreme left and extreme right represent the recto and verso respectively of one fragment, and the two images in the center, the recto and verso of the second fragment. The fragments were rolled up into one scroll, and the top left and bottom right, more damaged segments, represent the outside layers of this scroll. And here we have two more close-up images of BL-28 that will give you actually a section of BL-28, but this will give you a better idea of the script and the writing method. And by the way, the manuscript was written from right to left and top to bottom. And this manuscript is in comparatively good shape, except again for the outer layers of the scroll. So I was very lucky in this. And now a bit of context. The Gandhari manuscripts record texts of a variety of genres and styles, from sutra to narrative biography to verse to exegesis. And the exegetical texts, my own area of interest, include both commentaries and also, apparently, independent scholastic treatises, whether expository, catechetical, or polemical in style. The exegetical text preserved in BL-28 is distinctive and perhaps unique, at least thus far, among the Gandhari manuscripts because it is polemical throughout with arguments on a limited topic between one text proponent and at least two different opponents. In contrast to other early Abhidharma polemical texts, BL-28 exhibits a more open structure, a more casual form of dialogue, variation in the positions that it presents, and at times statements or even arguments are repeated with various changes in each case. These all suggest a more fluid context of explication and very possibly pedagogical elaboration through which contending positions were gradually refined over time. Certainly, BL-28 appears to be the product of a polemical environment and might be assumed to be the direct expression of conflicting school identities. But it does not present stable, well-defined doctrinal positions that conform to the characterizations of school positions found in the later scholastic treatises or doxographies. It includes a label for only one opponent and does not identify or give school affiliations for either the other opponents in the text or the text proponent himself. This leaves a number of questions unanswered, which we might consider essential for our understanding of a polemical text. Did its arguments actually originate within a sectarian context? To what extent can the interpretations presented in BL-28 be correlated with positions attributed to specific schools and other sources? And does BL-28 contain any other evidence of school affiliations for its text proponent or his unidentified opponents? I'll return to these questions in my discussion of the second lesson that we can learn from BL-28, and I will suggest at that time that perhaps these questions in themselves may act to obscure our understanding of early exegetical texts. Now, why are the contents of the text recorded in BL-28 so significant? Even though the arguments presented touch on several issues, they revolve around, as Bob mentioned, what was to become one of the most important doctrinal topics in early Indian Buddhism, namely the existence of past and future factors. Both the initial and concluding, more damaged portions of the manuscript indicate that in the text recorded in BL-28, this topic may have been embedded within a discussion of religious practice. Specifically, These initial and concluding discussions examined whether past and future objects can serve as conditions for the arising either of contaminants or of the knowledge that is to be acquired through praxis. It is quite interesting and potentially significant for our understanding of relationships among early exegetical texts that the structure of this discussion of past and future factors in BL 28 appears similar to the examination of the same topic in the Abhidharmakosha Bhasha, which is also framed by a discussion of conditions for the arising of contaminants. In the major portion of BL 28, the text proponent presents various positions on the existence of past and future factors, according to at least two different opponents. And each position is followed by the text proponent's own point-by-point criticism, which, by the way, he offers without clarifying his own position. The first series of arguments examines the existence of past and future factors, specifically in relation to the operation of action, or karman. The text proponent first cites the position of an unidentified opponent who proposes that three categories of past and future factors must be admitted to exist, two of which I'll mention here. One category of past factors, that is, actions whose matured effects have not yet matured, includes broadly all past actions whose effects have not yet arisen and whose efficacy has not been obstructed through religious praxis. The opponent claims that these past actions, like all causes, must be said to exist in order to account for their ability to produce an effect at a later time. A second category, namely the state of being a matured effect, refers to future factors, specifically the future matured effects of action. Similarly, the opponent claims that these future effects must be admitted to exist, since a non-existent thing cannot be said to arise. Thus, the opponent claims that these two categories of past and future factors must exist in order to support the operation of karman. Following his presentation of the opponent's position, the text proponent offers a detailed criticism, devoting greatest attention to these two categories that I've just briefly described. And I'll interrupt myself here and say, aren't you glad I'm only discussing two categories? Could go on. In any case, the second series of arguments constitutes the second half and remainder of the text, and it concerns the issue that marks the real importance of BL 28, namely the proposition, everything exists. And in this proposition, of course, everything includes both past and future factors. The section begins by quoting the position of an opponent who first offers the proposition and then expands upon it through a series of formulaic declarations. I'll read this, it's on the slide, but my reading it might help a bit. You might wish to say, everything exists. Everything exists at all times, everything exists everywhere, everything exists. Everything exists at all times, everything exists everywhere, everything exists with every aspect, everything exists through every reason, everything exists through all modes, everything exists through all causes, everything exists through all conditions, everything exists. Certainly, since this opponent here, again, whose view is cited here by TP, that is the text proponent, right? This is the view of his opponent. Since the opponent espouses here the hallmark Sarvastivada position, everything exists, we would assume that he should in some way be connected with these Sarvastivadins. And he is in fact identified by the text proponent as a Maha Sarvastivada in Gandhari. I would note here, though, that this specific label with the prefix Maha, or great, is not attested in any other Buddhist text. And the significance of this prefix in this case is uncertain. I played around with it endlessly, trying to come up with possible interpretations, but its significance is uncertain. Despite this seemingly clear identification of the opponent as a Maha Sarvastivada, on certain points in his arguments, his views deviate in interesting and important ways from Sarvastivada positions cited in other sources. Specifically Sarvastivada sources or Abhidharma sources of all periods. We should keep in mind here that we do indeed find variety among Sarvastivada positions cited in various Abhidharma sources, and sometimes even within a single source. And thus, even in the case of a well-attested school label, such as Sarvastivada, we will find that it is not consistent over, that is, the positions attributed to them are not consistent over time and geography. And since the other opponents cited in BL 28 and the text proponent himself are never associated with school labels, we may not be justified in our efforts to attribute school affiliations widely to texts or teachers that date from this early period. In fact, it might be better to see the application of school labels to very early texts as retrojections from a later period when the labels had come to be standardized and were assumed to be important historical information. Now, after further elaboration by the opponent on his proposition, everything exists, the text proponent offers a point-by-point criticism. I'll mention just one example to give you an idea of his arguments, that is, the text proponent's arguments. If everything exists, as the opponent claims, one must also admit the existence of such non-existent entities as the soul or the person, which are generally rejected in early Buddhist teaching, or certain non-existent members of doctrinal categories as the sixth aggregate, 13th sense sphere, 19th element, and 5th noble truth. And why are they rejected? Well, because early Buddhist teaching recognizes only, right, 5 aggregates, 12 sense spheres, 18 elements, and 4 noble truths, as we all may know. Now, if we look for connections between the text recorded in BL 28 and other early exegetical texts, we should first note that we do not find a large-scale parallel. That is to say, BL 28 does not preserve a text that we know from another source, whether from Buddhist textual collections, translations, or other manuscripts. Even though there is no large-scale parallel, there are texts that discuss similar issues, present analogous arguments, and even share some brief sections with similar phrasing. For example, Several of the arguments presented in BL 28, especially in the section on everything exists, occur in other Abhidharma texts of all periods, but they are most similar to certain sections of the Pali Kathavatu and the Aryavasumitra Bodhisattva Sangiti Shastra, which is extant in Chinese translation. But the arguments in BL 28, that is in comparison with these other texts, are simpler and less formulaic, and its structure is less rigid. At several points, the text repeats a previous argument with few apparent additions, perhaps indicating minimal attention to the overall structure of the text, and little or no revision of the text as a whole. Thus, it would appear that in contrast to other early expository texts, BL 28 preserves methods of exegesis and arguments in relatively unrevised, unredacted, and certainly in unpolished form. The relatively simple arguments in all of these early texts set the stage for the more complex and abstract controversies on the nature of existence and the precise activity of existent factors that developed in later Abhidharma texts. As important, treatments in these early texts provide a context for these later controversies and suggest that they emerged from specific problems involving practical issues, primarily of causation and religious practice. And this, then, I would suggest, is the singular importance of the contents of BL 28. And now, let's turn to the second and perhaps more important, or so I now think, more important lesson we can learn from BL 28. Here I'm thinking of general issues that grow throughout one's work on a text, giving rise to both questions and methodological directives. And specifically, I'm alluding to the more general issues that are implicit within the phrase elusive text in the title of my presentation. So what exactly am I suggesting here by the phrase elusive text? I think that we would all acknowledge that texts do change over time as a result of different intentions and perspectives at various points in what we might view as their history. And so we might feel comfortable saying that a text is elusive. But we might also object to the adjective elusive and respond that it is our job as textual scholars to establish the text or to make it clear and definite. But can this be done? In my early work on texts, this goal of establishing the text appealed to me, but I'm no longer sure that it does. I now see within it an assumption that I would not support, or that I would say at least needs qualification, and at least in the case of early texts. I think that this goal assumes that there is a text that somehow moves throughout various transformations, waiting to be made clear and definite. In other words, we are assuming a single referent or identity in some sense of the text that we are studying. Now you might respond, no, that's not the case. It's just a matter of convenience and of the limitations of language that force us into this kind of imprecise statement. But I'm no longer so sure. I would suggest that we do indeed, often without thinking, assume the identity over time of the text with which we work. Even if we would not admit an essential text, we speak of the text as undergoing change or revisions in the form of material being added to it or removed from it, and so forth. And in our minds, the text somehow and in some form remains throughout it all. Or we compare what we would view as different texts. We compare them, attempting to find large-scale parallels or at least connections of some kind among them. And again, you might respond that this is just what we do when we work with texts. What is the need to reconsider our views of the nature of the text itself? Now, like any assumption, this assumption of textual identity over time or of some kind of persistent, essential text can in very subtle ways shape our objectives, direct our inquiry, and predetermine our conclusions. At the very least, we should bring our assumptions about the text to the surface, consciously examine them and their possible ramifications, and decide how we would like to handle them. We might easily appreciate the importance of our assumptions when the texts themselves are our primary or only form of historical evidence, which is often the case for very early texts. But I would suggest that our assumptions are important for texts of all periods, and indeed for all types of textual studies. Our assumptions dictate the type of addition that we undertake, the translation and interpretation. They also shape our models for textual composition, transmission, and reception, as well as our understanding of textual collections and our perspective concerning possible relationships among texts. So we should turn to that fundamental question and ask, what exactly is it that I am reading? Or specifically, what is the text? Our answer will lead us in turn to reconsider a second, equally important question, that is, how then are texts best approached? And to offer my tentative conclusions here at the outset, I would suggest that we will discover the importance of context and change over time, or history. And this will lead us to adopt a view of text as process and a contextually or historically sensitive approach to texts. But before we get into this discussion of the text, I would add an important caveat. My comments are most applicable to early texts, and they are, of course, based upon the textual evidence that we currently have, whether in the form of oral or written textual collections or manuscripts, or texts that exist in another form. We have to remember that only a fraction of early Buddhist texts have been preserved, and hence our textual evidence is severely limited. Thus, as greater textual evidence is revealed, we should stand ready to be corrected, and I am. Even though today I'm focusing on the Gandhari manuscripts and BL 28 in particular, my doubts about the ability to establish texts, that is, to make them clear and definite, and my concern with the approach that we should take to texts actually emerged slowly over the course of my research on Abhidharma, and then intensified in my work on the Gandhari manuscripts. There are several aspects of Abhidharma that changed my previous assumptions, but I'll mention just one, that is categories and how they were understood and applied in Abhidharma texts. One quickly discovers that in Abhidharma, categories were generally considered to be stable and unchanging, but an examination of several Abhidharma texts, even those self-identified as representing the same school and preserved in the same language, reveals that categories did indeed change both across texts and over time. In other words, they have a history. Such changes in a category or in its members almost always remained unacknowledged by the text themselves, since the objective of the text was to establish themselves within what they understood to be a stable and unchanging tradition. And yet, by going back to the specific textual contexts within which the categories emerged, one can discover the reasons for a category and its members, as well as for changes in them. This discovery, and indeed at the time it seemed to me to be an amazing and remarkable discovery, led me to two ideas. First, categories had an important function as markers of both doctrinal positions and group identity for the texts themselves, for the tradition, and also for us. And their apparent stability was a necessary byproduct of this function. And second, categories and their members did in fact change over time, even if the change was not acknowledged by the tradition or by us. And this change or history provides an understanding of the nature of the category and of its members, as well as of their significance, which may not be apparent in their application within the text. Now, my discovery about Abhidharma categories extended to other aspects of Abhidharma as well, and I carried this new perspective about the tension between stability and change into my work on the Gandhari manuscript, where it gained extra force. And I had no choice but to question many previous assumptions. And why is that? Well, to be blunt, manuscripts are messy. They are absolutely, terribly messy. And they are difficult to smooth into accepted categories, whether these categories be of texts or any other characterization. They constantly test our approaches that may have seemed useful in our work on other texts that are more, what shall I say, more tame. Research on manuscripts presents the perfect challenge to our assumptions and approach, and I accepted that challenge. And so let's return to our two questions. What is the text, and how are texts best approached? First, what assumptions might we have about the nature of the text? I'll mention just two. Do we view the text as having a stable identity, existing as an essential text transmitted through time? Or do we view the text as existing only as transformations over time? In the former viewpoint of the essential text, there are also two possibilities: an original text that represents the author's intention, or an ideal work that exists as an abstraction implied by its different versions. And when I say there are two possibilities, as I talk now, I can think of another possibility, but nonetheless, we'll just mention those two. In either case, later editors and translators would hope to restore the essential text by correcting the accretions, omissions, and accidents of history. By contrast, in the latter viewpoint of the text as transformations over time, the text as such exists only as a process or as stratified, that is, as a continual process of reconstitution through successive or even simultaneous strata, each of which differs in certain ways from the others. Its multiple forms exist as historical instances, fashioned by all of the different agents that create the text: reciters or authors, transmitters, scribes, commentators, translators, and audiences. That is, by the collective of interpretive communities that extend up to and include the editor, translator, and reader in the present moment. In textual studies and literary criticism, we can find these two viewpoints guiding various approaches, with the first that presumes an essential text, whether an author's original text or an abstract work, dominating in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In the mid to late 20th century, the focus on the essential text was challenged by literary theories that emphasized historical and cultural context and shared the viewpoint of text as process. Of course, the first viewpoint that supports a text with a stable identity was not limited to literary critical theorists or to textual scholars. It was also a fundamental assumption of the various Buddhist traditions, or so the traditional accounts would suggest. We find it implicit in the attempts to attribute at least certain texts to individual authors, create textual genres, establish textual collections, and of course, associate these texts or collections with specific schools. But we have little evidence, apart from claims within the texts themselves, that in the early period at least, these various identities in the form of particular authors and schools actually existed as described. Now, my work in Abhidharma and on the Gandhari manuscripts has led me to support the second viewpoint of the text as process. Indeed, I would take the rather radical position, or extreme position, that a text exists only as its various strata over time and space. And the unified or single text is a construct first offered by the tradition and then readily accepted by many of us who unconsciously expect text to exist in this way. But the Gandhari manuscript evidence suggests that in the early period at least, individual texts may have had a more tenuous existence. In the model of text as process, an individual text would not preserve content with a single source, but rather would consist of the combination of discrete instances or concretized moments that capture only a portion of the fluid and multifaceted teaching traditions. Although the manuscript material associated with different early traditions of Buddhism presents certain evidence of what might be viewed as similar or related texts, other early texts, and perhaps the majority of them, appear to be local compositions representing variations on shared textual genres, ranging from narratives to scholastic treatises. In other words, it seems that the conditions for the standardization of texts were only beginning to emerge at the time of our Gandhari manuscripts. Now, I should add here that even though I don't think that we can accept any individual or particular text as preserving the teaching of the Buddha or any other early teacher, that does not mean that these very early teachings were not preserved across the range of early texts. And so, if we accept this more flexible viewpoint of text as process, what are the consequences? First, as I've suggested, we would acknowledge the overriding importance of content and history, and we would accept the inevitability of fluidity and change as the norm. At least for the early period, our objective would also change from one of uncovering what we assume to be the underlying essential text to one of clarifying the particular instance or stratum that is presented in any given textual witness. When we encounter other witnesses of textual material that are similar in some way, these would become discrete moments in a multifaceted and complex history that might then be associated by the later traditions or by certain of us with what had come to be recognized as one text. The second consequence of this fluid model of the text as process concerns our view of how texts were composed and initially transmitted. It would challenge the traditional model of the memorized preservation of an oral presentation or a single composition by one author, which were quickly transmitted as discrete texts that could support relationships of dependence, forming a textual lineage. By contrast, in the model of text as process, this process of textual composition would occur in each community through the constant input of living and changing teaching. Even though previous teachings could be preserved, and indeed were preserved in certain cases, each text would become a record of textual practice shaped by the historical context of its composition, with a meaning that is reformulated through repeated acts of reception involving continual reappropriation. Rather than viewing texts as wholes, we would view them as resulting from the combination of small units of explication, what we might call kernels or modules. These modules, stored in shared oral or written traditional storehouse in one such, could be assembled as needed as in certain pedagogical or exegetical contexts, thus giving rise to multiple instances of similar textual production. Only over time did these collocations of modules become stabilized and then transmitted as independent texts. Such a model of textual composition, that is by modules, and the fluid texts that result call for an approach that is sensitive to context and history, or what I would refer to as a historically sensitive approach. This approach entails a fundamental but quite simple shift in perspective. Rather than assuming and looking for constancy, we would expect and highlight difference. In the case of text editing and translation, rather than assuming a single text that undergoes changes over time, we would see all strata, interpreters, and contexts as potentially of equal heuristic value, depending, of course, upon our initial questions. As historians, we would note the particular socio-historical conditions of individuals and institutions at specific points in time, and look for both their interpretive contributions and the distinctive nature of their textual products. And our purpose would be one of clarifying this succession of reinterpretation that then becomes the meaning of the text. This historically sensitive approach would also be appropriate for materials that emerge within a religious tradition as the product of shifting ideological concerns. For each new textual interpretation, we would take into account the historical dynamics of change in both the content of the text themselves and in group self-understanding. Thus, the apologetic perspective of the tradition would become one important historical datum among many. This change in our understanding of the text and its composition and transmission would also change our view of what the focus or center of our approach should be. Our new historically sensitive approach would be based on the defining medium of exchange among early textual materials, namely that of the module rather than the text as a whole. Accordingly, we would shift our perspective from a text-centered to a module-centered approach. We would abandon reifying assumptions, whether they be of a root text, inherent work, or textual parallel, all of which depend upon the notion of a discrete text and entail textual relationships conceived as dependencies, borrowings, or reassignments. Finally, we would reconsider intertextuality, or relationships among what would appear to be different texts. Certainly, in our work on all texts, we consult other texts. And for early texts also, and especially for those preserved in manuscripts, we do turn to similar passages in other texts for help with the difficult tasks of the initial reading, transcription, and reconstruction. But how do we understand these similarities among texts? We often speak in terms of parallels, but what do we mean by that? Once again, as I mentioned in my comments on the nature of the text, I think that most of us think in terms of different versions of the same text, or perhaps discrete texts that are at least related through shared origin or some other kind of textual dependence. But is this view acceptable, especially in the case of early texts? Again, you could respond that the notion of parallels doesn't present a problem. After all, we can always view the text involved as partial parallels, but this still conjures up the notion of a relationship among discrete and independent texts. Once again, I would suggest that we shift our perspective entirely and consider the scale on which the similarities exist. Larger scale similarities of longer passages or of entire texts are indeed found at a later period in the history of the text compared. But in the case of early texts, similarities are almost always found on a much smaller scale, that is, on the level of modules. And in fact, in the case of the early text preserved in the Gandhari manuscripts, this is, in most cases, exactly what we do find. And so, I will end here and take any questions you might have. Are we doing questions now?
Yes.
Okay.
We would like to start with the second part of today's event. So it's a symposium with three speakers, which Professor Baba Sensei will start. Sorry, you're known like this universally among all the students. And basically, the idea is there's no Q&E afterwards, but if there are technical, very clear questions, just comprehension, that we will entertain briefly. After the three lectures, the speakers, the symposium, and also Colette will be up here for the final discussion. Please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming back. So first of all, I would like to say congratulations to Professor Colette Cox for winning this year's Toshihide Numata Book Award. As a fan of her research, I am very pleased and honored to be here. I also would like to thank Professor Robert Sharp for inviting me to speak here today and BDK Foundation for their generous support to Buddhist studies. I'm gonna talk about the beginning of modern Japanese studies on especially early Buddhism and Abhidharma literature. Because Japan has over a century research on Sarvastivada Abhidharma texts, which is nevertheless almost unknown to Western scholars except Professor Colette Cox. Japanese scholars' research on Abhidharma during the first quarter of the 20th century is so influential that 20th century Japanese scholars in this field follow the approach established in this period. In order to understand the impact that Professor Cox's new book will give on this field, it is worth to know the beginning of modern Japanese studies on early Buddhism and Abhidharma literature. First, let us go back to the mid-19th century Buddhist studies in Europe. Eugene Burnouf, great father of modern Buddhist studies, published the revolutionary book, Introduction à l'Histoire du Bouddhisme indien, in 1844. He categorized Buddhism all over Asia into two. One is Northern Buddhism, Buddhism septentrional, which translated the Sanskrit scriptures into Chinese or Tibetan. And the other is Southern Buddhism, Buddhism meridional, which transmitted Pali Canon and commentary from Sri Lanka to mainland Southeast Asia. This classification was totally new, and we could say these two concepts of Buddhism are Burnouf's invention. In his world map, Northern Buddhism spread to pink-colored areas, and Southern Buddhism spread to yellow-colored areas. After this classification came to be shared by scholars working on Buddhism, an interesting argument arose. Now we know there are two kinds of Indic Buddhist scriptures, Sanskrit and Pali. Then which scripture is original one? By 1870s, European scholars came to an agreement that Pali is the original language of Buddhist scriptures. In the preface to a dictionary of the Pali language, R.C. Childers says the Pali or southern version of the Buddhist scriptures is the only genuine and original one. R.C. Childers also states that Pali was the Magadha language which the Buddha spoke. In light of present-day Buddhist studies, however, this view is not accurate. As Professor Oscar von Hinüber discussed in his article, The Oldest Buddhist Language, Pali is not language of Magadha, but artificial language, or a sort of church language. Although R.C. Childers died just after he published his dictionary, T.W. Rhys-Davids succeeded his project. In 1881, T.W. Rhys-Davids founded the Pali Texts Society in London. Professor Rupert Gethin, next speaker, is the president of the Pali Texts Society now. Rhys-Davids started to publish Pali texts and the English translations from the Pali Texts Society. In 19th century, European scholars such as Rhys-Davids regarded the main body of Sthapitaka and Vinaya-Pitaka in Pali Canon as early Buddhist texts and supposed that they were compiled by the Ashokan period, namely the 3rd century BCE. Max Muller, professor at the University of Oxford, also supported to the Buddhist scholars' agreement that the Pali or southern version of the Buddhist scriptures is the only genuine and original one. About the Skarbhati Vyuha, of which his disciple, Nanjo Bunyu, brought the manuscript to Oxford, Max Muller said, quote, "This sutra sounds to us, no doubt, very different from the original teaching of Buddha. This doctrine of Amitabha and all the Mahayana doctrine is a secondary form of Buddhism, a corruption of the pure doctrine of the royal prince, unquote. We are in Jodo Shinshu Center, so I feel very bad to say this, but don't misunderstand me. This is the words of Max Muller, not my words. Actually, in 1880s Japan, Max Muller's this statement was made advantage of Christian propaganda by American missionary M.L. Gordon to criticize Japanese Buddhism. Many Japanese Buddhists had strong reactions to such propaganda. Even Nanjo Bunyu, Max Muller's old student at Oxford and the first Japanese Indologist, became the target of criticism. So he had to make an excuse on a public statement in 1886. He said, Dr. Max Muller is my literary teacher, but not religious teacher. From 1880s to 1890s, Japanese Buddhist criticism to European Buddhist studies continued in Japan. However, next generation of Japanese scholars, such as Takatsu Junjiro and Anesaki Masaharu, who studied in Europe in 1890s, accepted such European scholars' agreement. Not only accepting such agreement, they started a new approach which had never done in Europe. At the same time, these two scholars founded the Department of Indian Philosophy at the Imperial University of Tokyo in 1904. The name Indian philosophy, or Indo Tetsugaku in Japanese, actually pointed to Buddhist studies. They probably chose this name to open Buddhist studies section as a part of philosophy department in the National University. If you look at their research around the beginning of the 20th century, you will see how they were struggling to make new approach to Indian Buddhism at the university. In 1900, Takatsu published the Pali Chretomathy. This archaic English title was named by Takatsu himself. As the title says, this is an anthology of Pali texts for students. Interestingly, Takatsu added traditional Chinese title from agamas to each Pali text. At the end of the 19th century, he had already begun the comparative research of Pali Nikayas and Chinese agamas. Another founder, Anesaki, also worked on the correspondence table of 4 agamas and Nikayas. With the help of his students, Anesaki published it in 1908. In the Department of Indian Philosophy at the Imperial University of Tokyo, these two founding professors taught students the comparative research of Pali and Chinese sources. They also provided the historical perspective, which Japanese had never had before. In 1899, Anesaki published History of Buddhist Scriptures, and in 1910, he published a new book on early Buddhism, titled Fundamental Buddhism. In this book, he tried to reconstruct the oldest form of Buddhism by using Pali, Sanskrit, and Chinese materials, although it is very preliminary stage from the modern viewpoint. It is also interesting that a book, Deeds of King Ashoka, was published by Mori Rintaro and Omura Seigai. Mori Rintaro is one of the most famous novelists in Japan. His pen name is Mori Ogai. Possibly some of you know his name. According to the preface to this book, these two authors asked Takatsu Junjiro to revise the manuscripts before the publication. Mori Ogai studied in Germany, and then that's why he actually quoted many books from German articles and books. This book is the first study of King Ashoka based on European archaeological research and various Chinese materials of this king. In the Department of Indian Philosophy in the Imperial University of Tokyo, Kimura Taiken learned comparative research of Pali and Chinese texts and historical perspective from Takatsu and Anesaki. Just 3 years after his graduation, he joined the faculty of the same department. He was appointed as a lecturer in 1912 and associate professor in 1917. From 1919 to 1922, just after the First World War, he studied in UK and Germany, supported by Japanese government. In the UK, Kimura learned Pali studies with T.W. Rhys-Davids. It was just before Rhys-Davids died. At that time, Rhys-Davids was working on the Pali English dictionary. Kimura completed his books on early Buddhism and Abhidharma literature during his stay in England. Actually, he mentioned T.W. Rhys-Davids. That he learned Pali Abhidharma from him. And in 1922, Kimura published a theory on early Buddhist thought and a study of Abhidharma literature in Japanese. Kimura's two books show new approach to early Buddhism and Abhidharma literature. In my viewpoint, his approach has two eminent features which most Japanese scholars in this field followed through the 20th century. One, Kimura did philological analysis of each Abhidharma text with comparative research of it and the other traditions. Two, he argued for new chronology of Buddhist texts by making distinction between early Buddhism and Abhidharma literature, and also making relative chronology of Sarvasvada Abhidharma texts. As for the first point, Kimura did the high-quality philological research of each Abhidharma text with his knowledge of Pali, Sanskrit, and Chinese. For instance, Kimura successfully did comprehensive study of the term Vivajavada, or Vivajavadin, in the Vibhashya Compendia, and compare the context and the meaning of the term in the other texts, such as Pali texts. Although Sri Lankan Theria, or so-called Theravada, calls itself Vivajavada, or Vivajavadin, Kimura concluded that Vivajavada in the Vibhashya is not related to the Theria school in Sri Lanka. As Professor Cox has noted in her excellent book, moreover, Kimura's research clarified that in the Vibhashya Compendia, the term Vivajavada means those who maintain distinctions whose views are to be rejected. Kimura had done this research 103 years ago. As for the second point, Kimura made new chronology of Buddhist texts. Kimura made the distinction between early Buddhism and Abhidharma literature by creating the new approach to early Buddhism. Kimura supposed that common parts of the Sutta Pitaka and the Vinaya Pitaka come from the prototype of Buddhist canon compiled by mid-3rd century BCE, and the Abhidharma Pitaka was compiled between the 2nd century BCE and the beginning of the Common Era. Firstly, because Sarvasvada Abhidharma does not match well the Taittiriya Abhidharma, and also because there is no mention of Abhidharma in any inscriptions. Kimura's strategy was clear. He thought that European research on only Pali scriptures is not enough to elucidate pre-Ashokan Buddhist texts. In order to discuss early Buddhism, he insisted the importance of comparative research of Pali and Chinese materials. Kimura made the framework of Japanese research on early Buddhism. Through the 20th century, many scholars adopted this approach and published articles and books. I think the most excellent scholar who carried out this approach was Hirakawa Akira. Hirakawa's research on the Vinaya was a comparative research studies of Vinayas belonging to several schools. That is Taittiriya or Theravada, Mahishasaka, Dharmaguptaka, Sarvasvada, Murasarvasvada, and the Mahasangika. By this approach, Hirakawa successfully elucidated the common contents and structure of main body of the Vinaya Pitaka shared by several schools. While Kimura created the new approach to early Buddhism, he published a sort of working hypothesis on how Buddhists developed their texts from early Buddhist texts to Abhidharma literature in each school. This is his relative chronology of Sarvasvada Abhidharma. 1. Sutras similar to Abhidharma texts. Actually, there are many sutras titled Vibhanga Sutra in Sutra Pitaka, like Satya Vibhanga Sutta or Salayatana Vibhanga Sutra, and so forth. And then he thought that this is the first stage of the Abhidharma literature. And 2, Abhidharma texts similar to the sutras, such as Sangiti Pariyaya and then Dharma Skanda. 3, independent canonical Abhidharma treatises, the other 5 treatises of Sarvasvada Abhidharma Pitaka. And 4, non-canonical Abhidharma texts from the beginning of Common Era to the 5th century, such as the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya. Kimura also supposed that after early Buddhism, canonical Abhidharma literature was composed and Mahayana scriptures followed the canonical Abhidharma literature. It is noteworthy that he explains the rise of the Mahayana Buddhism partly as criticism to Abhidharma literature. This view came to be a strong tendency of Japanese scholars' discourse on the rise of Mahayana Buddhism in the 20th century. After the Second World War, monumental books on Sarvasvada Abhidharma were published by Watanabe Bayu, Mizuno Kogen, Fukuhara Ryogon, Sakurabe Hajime, Kawamura Kosho, Nishigi Yu, Sakamoto Yukio, and so forth. Most of them studied with Kimura or his disciples. Their philological analysis of each Abhidharma text is so sharp that we have to learn them for Abhidharma research till now. However, Kimura's chronology, followed by 20th century Japanese scholars, must be examined now. Professor Colette Cox says in her new book, scholars interested in the formative period of both texts and doctrinal interpretations have been compelled to score these later textual creations for any scrap of potential evidentiary value. But more often than not, within this historical vacuum, they turn to internal textual reconstructions based on hypotheses and extrapolations about form and content created on the basis of critical readings of the established text. A decomposition of stratigraphy, as it were, of the later transmitted teaching corpus. However, this process of reasoning backwards or retrojecting interpretive positions as derived from later textual reconstructions or creations is an activity beset with obstacles and missteps. Indeed, much of the results may not be successful in revealing earlier stages, unquote. I think this statement is crucial for the next generation of Abhidharma scholars. To understand her statement, just take a look at the absolute dating of Abhidharma literature, such as carbon dating or translation, dating of Chinese translation. Here, I mainly pick up canonical Sarvasvada Abhidharma texts. As you see, most of extant canonical Sarvasvada Abhidharma texts were translated from the 4th century to 7th century. It is much later than even early Mahayana scriptures such as Perfection of Wisdom or Skavati Vyuha translated into Chinese in the 2nd century. We are only sure that a few fragments of Abhidharma texts and Anshika's translation of Panchavastuka existed in the 1st or 2nd century CE. As you see in Professor Cox's book, Gandharan discoveries raise many questions to relative chronology. Were canonical Abhidharma texts compiled after Sutta Pitaka and Vinaya Pitaka? Were early Mahayana scriptures really later than canonical Abhidharma texts? Do extant canonical Abhidharma texts predate argument on everything exists written in Gandhari manuscripts? In this way, we have to critically examine the relative chronology from another aspect, such as absolute dating. Unfortunately or fortunately, it turned out that we have to reconstruct the chronology of Indic Buddhist texts by textual, archaeological, or epigraphical evidence. There are a lot of mysteries in history of Buddhist texts. There are many things to do for scholars in this field. In other words, we have begun a new journey to a great ocean of Buddhist texts. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It really is a great honor to be here contributing to this symposium celebrating the award of this prize to Colette Cox. I'm one of her great admirers, and I'm also very grateful to her, both for her generosity in time when I've had questions about Sarvastivada Abhidharma, and also, obviously, for her rich publications and her book on disputed dharmas, which is on my shelf. Sadly, it's not very well bound, and my copy is falling apart, but that's a reflection of how much I have consulted it over the last 10 years and more. I have you see the title, Why Are Beings Born Without Consciousness? At this stage in the afternoon, you might be tempted to say it's because they study too much Abhidharma, but that is not the reason the Abhidharma texts give. I'm going to talk, I'm going to pick up something in Collett's book about polemical debate. And being a scholar of Pali, I'm turning to the Katha Vatu. And this hopefully also picks up to some extent on the comments made in her lecture, in Collett's lecture, about the elusive text. And also this issue, if you like, about Pali texts, as we've just learned, they were edited very early on. We know what they are. There are these editions. They've been translated and whatever. And so we don't need to kind of work on them anymore because it's been done. So the Katha Vatu is actually one of the most difficult books in the Theravada Abhidhamma. And I've puzzled over bits of it over many hours. So I just want to... And what's interesting, well, there are things that we can say, but I mean, I've struggled. I'm going to talk about a sort of almost, well, it's about a page in the Pali Text Society edition, and it's there in Pali on the slide at the moment. And I read through this, and what is this about? What's going on? And it's a very difficult text. I mean, as it's printed, the text, it's clearly, you can see that it's a dialogue. I'm cutting to the English translation because there are questions and there are these words correct. So it's clearly a dialogue's going on, but the text itself tells us nothing about the identity of the speakers. And what becomes apparent is sometimes, you begin to think, well, the person answering the questions should always be the same person, but it clearly isn't. And with the Katha Vatu, of course, we're lucky to some extent in that we have a commentary, which tells us what it all means. But even with the commentary, it's quite hard to work out what's going on. So I mean, working in this short piece of the Katha Vatu made me appreciate just the achievement of Collett in working with these fragments and with no commentary, with no indication at all of who's speaking and so forth. Because even with those tools, it's quite hard to work on a text like the Katha Vatu. So the commentary gives you some answers, but of course it also raises questions. And of course the commentary, well, it's traditionally dated around the 5th century CE, so it may be, who knows, 700 years or more after the Katha Vatu itself. But it obviously contains earlier materials, the commentary itself. But it's obviously a later exegetical text which has its own way of reading the Katha Vatu. So for the moment, I'm just going to read out a bit of my translation in English of this bit of the Katha Vatu. So this is the debate on what leads to rebirth as an unconscious being. So the attainment of the cessation of cognition and feeling, Sanya Vedayata Nirodha, leads to rebirth as an unconscious being. Correct. Does someone who has attained the cessation of cognition and feeling have the skillful root non-greed, the skillful root non-hatred, the skillful root non-delusion, faith, vigor, mindfulness, concentration, and understanding? We should not say that. And so on. Does someone who has attained the cessation of cognition and feeling not have the skillful root non-greed, the skillful root non-hatred, and so on, and understanding? Correct. In that case, we should not say that the attainment of the cessation of cognition and feeling leads to rebirth as a being without cognition. Okay, so we follow it, all crystal clear, the argument? Do I need to say any more? Okay. So the first problem, of course, is these and so ons. Payala, pay. What do we put in there? We can the usual practice, of course, when you come across this, is you go back to try and, back in the text, somewhere it must have what you put in here. If you go back to the beginning of the Kata-Vatu, it has a whole series of even in the text, they're called these 8 refutations, these niggaha. And each of these 8 niggaha has 5 sections. So here you have the first section of the 8 niggaha, right? So you see there's quite a lot there. And I'm not going to read it all out. I mean, the crunch comes right at the end. What you say is false, namely, that it can be said that the attainment of the cessation of cognition and feeling leads to rebirth as a being without cognition. But it cannot be said that someone who has attained the cessation of cognition and feeling has the skillful root, non-greed, and understanding. So we have this quite complicated back and forth, which demonstrates the contradiction between 2 statements, that it can be said that the attainment of cessation of cognition and feeling leads to rebirth as a being without cognition, and it cannot be said that someone who has attained the cessation of cognition and feeling has the skillful root of non-greed. Okay, it all begins to get a bit tangled. So, well, for those of you who like this sort of thing, I confess this is not mine, I borrowed it from someone. We can express all this in symbolic logic and get to the heart of the matter. That P and not Q is false. There we are, that's all we need. I mean, it is quite interesting to try and unpack the moves in terms of logic that the text is making. So I'm going to come back to try and explain the argument in a minute, don't worry. I'm just reflecting a little bit on this and so on. So the and so on, this first and so on, if we put everything in, we would add another 10 pages at that point in the Kata-Vatu. I find it's absolutely, well, it's quite unclear to me whether we are meant to put all of this in. And this, in some Abhidhamma texts, I feel fairly confident that what the and so on stands for. It seems fairly clear. In the Kata-Vatu, I'm not really sure. A lot of it works without putting in these and so ons. It seems to me, and this goes back to that kind of the elusive text, the fluid text, the not fixed text, is the text saying, well, you can put in a bit here if you want to, you can put it all in, you can put as much, you make your choice. If you feel like it, put the whole thing in. So this raises questions about how a text like the Kata-Vatu is working as a polemical text. I mean, obviously, it's a text, the arguments are internal. The logical arguments, they're never to do with universal questions. They're Buddhist questions. And the two people arguing, the proponent, if you like, what the commentary calls our proponent and the opponent, they're arguing about the definition of Buddhist terms. And the way to defeat your opponent is to say that the way they define a Buddhist term or understand a Buddhist term is to say that it has consequences that are problematic for some other Buddhist term, that it will contradict something in the logic of Buddhist texts in Buddhist Abhidhamma. But the text itself returns all this redundant, logically redundant arguments and repetition. So the actual reasoned arguments of the text work without all this repetition. So there's this big question about what they are doing there, all this stuff. And I'm not sure that I have the answer, but there's obviously perhaps a kind of mental training in kind of going back and forth. It's like going up and down, back and forth, so obviously to do it, and actually when you read it and try to follow it, it does boggle the mind a little, or more than a little. Okay, I'm now going to go back to try and actually understand the argument and what's going on in the Kata-Vatu. So there's a chart here which is Buddhist cosmology. So the Kata-Vatu is discussing here what it is, what makes you get born in this realm of the beings without cognition or the unconscious beings, the asanyasata or the asanjña sattva, right? So they are beings born there, exist in this realm for 500 eons without having a thought. But you're reborn there as a result, it seems in some way, of attaining the fourth jhana. And basically that's an agreement across certainly the Sarvastivada and Theravada Abhidharma traditions. Okay? So the Kathavatu, this debate is about this, is exactly what you have to do or avoid doing to not get there. Okay, so I'm just going to read this bit out from the Kathavatu commentary, which I think must be broadly right in terms of telling us what's going on here, even if we don't accept every detail of it, and I'll come to that a bit later. In this debate about what leads to rebirth as a being without cognition, the attainment without cognition, whose development is achieved during existence by way of distaste, viraga, for cognition, and also the attainment of cessation, are both called the cessation of cognition and feeling. That's the Sanya Vidayata Nirodha. In this way, there are two attainments of cessation of cognition and feeling. One that is ordinary, lokya, and one that is transcendent, lokuttara. Of these, the ordinary attainment, achieved by an ordinary being, leads to rebirth as a being without cognition. But the transcendent attainment, achieved by the noble ones, does not lead to rebirth as a being without cognition. So just to spell out the Theravada position, there are, from this commentary, there are three states that we can use the name cessation of cognition and feeling of. Right? So the first one is what the commentary calls asanya samapati, which is the attainment of non-cognition. It's achieved by an ordinary beings, pratujjana, by way of distaste for cognition. This is this viraga, distaste for chitta or vijnana, on the basis of the fourth jhana. And so it has cognition and feeling. It's just it's called this a cessation of the attainment of non-cognition, but it's really just a distaste for cognition. It actually has cognition and feeling. And therefore it has skillful roots. It has the skillful root of non-greed, the skillful root of non-hatred, the skillful root of non-delusion, faith, vigor, mindfulness, concentration, understanding. So that's the point. It's not really a true cessation. Then the Theravadins recognize the true one, the Nirodha Samapati, the attainment of cessation achieved by non-returners and arahats, so Arya, noble beings. So this is properly the cessation of cognition and feeling. And it is understood to be as achittaka. So it's without any chitta or cetasika, no mind or mental forces at all, nothing. And then the third one is the state that you are actually born in, the asanya satta. So you're born in this state. And that is also achittaka, no cetasika or whatever. So we have two states that are truly without mind and one that is just a distaste for mind. And then back to the Kathavatu commentary. However, there are those, such as the Hetuvadas, who do not make this distinction and hold the opinion that the cessation of cognition and feeling is without difference and leads to rebirth as a being without cognition. The initial question in the Kathavatu debate is addressed to them by our proponent. The proposition is the opponent's, the proposition that the cessation of cognition and feeling leads to rebirth as an unconscious being. The proposition is the opponent's. Now, since someone who has attained the ordinary attainment of non-cognition by way of distaste for consciousness does have non-greed, etc., while someone who has attained the attainment of cessation proper does not, in order to object on these grounds, our proponent states the words beginning, does someone who has attained the cessation of cognition and feeling have non-greed? Okay. Now, I don't know about the Hetuvadas, we can talk about that, but if we move to the Sarvastivadins, we have something that parallels exactly what the Theravadins, or the Kathavatu commentary is talking about. So the Theravadins talk about this asanjni samapati, so it's the attainment of non-cognition achieved by ordinary beings, but it is without chitta and chaita. So it's chitta chaitanam nirodha. So it's also achieved on the basis of the fourth jhana. So it's entirely without cognition and feeling, and so it doesn't have any of these skillful roots and so forth, because it doesn't have anything. They then also have the Nirodha Samapati, which is attained by Aryas. So this is also without chitta and chaita. And then they have the state of the unconscious beings, beings without cognition, without chitta and chaita. This is asanjnika. So we can now read the Kathavatu commentary informed by this, and we see that they are talking entirely at cross purposes. And the whole debate hinges on the fact that basically the proponent asks one question and the opponent answers assuming a completely different definition of the cessation of cognition and feeling. So, our proponent, the transcendent attainment of the cessation of cognition and feeling attained by Aryas leads to rebirth as a being without cognition. So the red bits are the explanatory bits, the bits I've added. The opponent, correct. But he means the ordinary attainment of the cessation of cognition and feeling attained by non-Aryas leads to rebirth as a being without cognition. Our proponent, does someone who has attained the transcendent cessation of cognition and feeling not have the skillful root non-greed, the skillful root non-hatred, etc., faith, vigor, mindfulness, concentration, and understanding? Correct. Someone who has attained any kind of cessation of cognition and feeling does not have skillful roots. Our proponents understand this refutation. If someone who has attained the transcendent cessation of cognition and feeling does not have the skillful root non-greed, the skillful root non-hatred, etc., we should not say that the attainment of cessation of cognition and feeling leads to rebirth as a being without cognition. So, there are some unspoken premises in the Theravada counterposition, I think, here. One is, why are they getting worked up about this, for example? Why is it an issue? Well, if the attainment, the ordinary attainment of the cessation, the ordinary attainment without cognition, if it's without mind, if it's truly achitaka, it cannot be kushala. And it cannot be akushala, it cannot be anything. And it certainly can't be a karma. And if it can't be a karma, an action, how does it have the effect of making you be reborn in the realm of the beings without cognition? So that's, the Theravada is bothered, the proponent in the text is bothered by this. And also, if asanjni samapati, so the ordinary attainment of non-cognition and the real proper attainment of cessation, if they're both without mind, then they become phenomenologically, indistinguishable. They're the same thing. So why would they have these two different effects? Why, when attained by ordinary beings, they lead to rebirth in this awful place? Well, we'll discuss whether it's awful, and not in the other case. So this is the assumption. Okay, I'm going to jump, though, to the end of the debate now, where suddenly the Kathavatu gives the opponent a voice, right? So the opponent leads the debate and asks the question. One should not say that the attainment of the cessation of cognition and feeling leads to rebirth as a being without cognition. And this now, it's the Theravadin proponent, our proponent, and he answers, correct. The transcendent attainment, which is properly without consciousness, leads to rebirth as a being without cognition. That's me glossing, right? The opponent, surely it is someone who is without cognition here in this life, who becomes also without cognition there in the next life. And our proponent says, correct, that is true. The ordinary attainment with distaste for consciousness leads to rebirth as a being without cognition. So the opponent now is saying, no, this refutation. If it is someone who is without cognition here in this life, who becomes also without cognition there in the next life, we should say that the attainment of cessation of cognition and feeling leads to rebirth as a being without cognition. And this is, interestingly, the last sentence of the debate. So it appears that the opponent, I mean, in the text itself, it appears that the opponent has won if you just the debate, if you just read the text as it's presented. The commentary, of course, won't have that. And the commentary says, someone's state of unconsciousness in this life resulting from its attainment by way of a distaste for consciousness is acceptable, and in the next life too, resulting from its attainment precisely by an unconscious being. Therefore, when the opponent establishes his position at the end by getting this assent from our proponent, he establishes it by sophistry, chala, right? The interesting thing is, though, that if you look back over the whole debate, our proponent has also established his position by sophistry. So the commentary is kind of, one person's sophistry is another person's brilliance in debate, is what's going on here, it seems. So I mean, within the Kathavastu here, I mean, we look at this example, I mean, I think we have genuine attempts and intellectually quite ingenious and sophisticated attempts to explore and tease out tensions in Buddhist doctrine. In the end, this debate, it seems to me, comes to ends in a debate about who can attain cessation of thought. The Theravada says only Aryas can actually stop the mind, right? If ordinary beings even get close by their distaste to trying to stop the mind, they're reborn as unconscious beings. The Sarvastivada says, well, an ordinary being and Aryas, they both can stop the mind, but when you do it as an ordinary being, you're in trouble. And yet, and the commentaries say that actually this attainment, it's a good attainment. They actually both classify it as kusala in some way in the fourth jhana. So the tensions are to some extent unresolved in this debate. But what is interesting is actually the debate as it's presented in the Kathavastu is still sort of open and more fluid. It's the commentary that kind of tries to draw a line under it and say we've won. But I think my time is probably up, so I must stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob, for your invitation, and to Sanjok for all your arrangements. And also, many thanks to the Numata Center for making this event possible. I'm very honored and humbled to give this talk in celebration of Professor Collie Cox's new book, receiving this Toshihide Numata Book Award. Congratulations. So, Professor Cox's study of the Gantari manuscript fragment BL28 is not only an invaluable philological contribution, but also a thorough philosophical examination of the sectarian Abhidharma debates surrounding the Sarvastivada position on the existence of the three time periods. From the philosophical perspective, one of the most challenging tasks in working with this manuscript, as I could imagine, is perhaps distinguishing the arguments of the proponents from those of the opponents. Not to mention that it is restored from Gantari. So this would have been easier if a Pali or Chinese parallel text were available, but unfortunately for this BL28, no such text exists. Nevertheless, Professor Cox meticulously clarifies the positions of each side of the doctrinal debate by drawing on parallel arguments preserved in a wide range of sectarian Abhidharma texts in Sanskrit, Pali, and Chinese. As I was reading her book, I repeatedly had the same experience. That is, whenever I came across a passage in part 1 of her book and thought of a comparable argument in another Abhidharma work, I would turn the page and discover that the author had already provided a detailed discussion. So in the end, I found myself unable to add anything because she had addressed almost all the possibilities I could think of. That means she addressed everything, sarvam, in her book. And she did. So this also explains why, I must confess, the title and the abstract of my talk were submitted rather late. I'm certain that this comprehensive study will soon become an exemplar of how Abhidharma studies ought to be done in the future. So what I would like to share today is directly related to this very content-rich book. Do the three time periods exist in and of themselves? Yeah. So, among the different explanations of the Sarvasivada tenet of tritemporal existence, the Mahavipasha mentions a specific opinion attributed to the Darshandika Vipajavadins, as shown here. So to facilitate the later discussion, I also quote the entire context. It is shown that the Mahavipasha is a commentary on the Jnana Prasthana. So its format is like it's always quote one passage from Jnana Prasthana and then followed by the commentary. So here, the quotation is past, future, and present dharmas. Question, this commentary. Why is this explanation made in the Jnana Prasthana? The answer, it is to refute other schools and to elucidate the correct principle. Some hold that time periods at one are different from conditioning forces, sanskaraha. So here sanskaraha are understood as Sanskrita dharmas, conditioned dharmas. So such as the Darshandika Vipajavadins. They make such statement. Time periods are permanent, while conditioning forces are impermanent. So here, taking time periods as permanent amounts to saying that time periods are unconditioned, asanskrita. So when conditioning forces traverse time periods, it is like fruit in a vessel passing from one vessel to another. This is one simile. Or like many people leaving one house and entering another, the second simile. Conditioned forces are likewise. They enter the present period from the future period and enter the past period from the present. So in order to refute their position and demonstrate that the time periods and conditioned forces are not different, it is stated that time periods and are precisely conditioned forces and vice versa. Therefore, another chapter in the Jnana Prasthana states us, what are the time periods? They refer to the conditioning forces indicated by this appellation. And then there's another refutation. I will come back to this point later. So Professor Cox knows that in the Gantari manuscript BL28, the opponent of this text, known as Mahasarvasivada, proposes two theories about the existence of time periods. So one suggests that dharmas exist in the past, present, and future exist. So the other suggests that the three time periods themselves exist, the second. Of course, the later Vaibhashikas understood the second idea of Attvano Sthita, the existence of three time periods, as simply an abbreviated expression of the first opinion that dharmas in the three time periods exist. However, Professor Cox associates this second idea in the manuscript with the Darshandika Vipajavada view that time periods are permanent, and thus interprets the last sentence to mean that the three time periods exist in and of themselves. Well, that was also my initial thought when reading her book. So yet, I have been wondering when I was teaching this part at Hong Kong U. Wouldn't taking time periods to be permanent be a rather strange idea for Buddhists? It was commonly acknowledged by all sectarian Buddhists that time is nothing more than the activity of the momentary arising and ceasing of conditioned dharmas. Moreover, no other existing Buddhist texts attributed to the Darshtanikas or Vipajavadins can cooperate the position on the existence of time periods. So supposing that time periods are 3 unconditioned dharmas, according to the Sarvastivada way of reasoning, according to their mindset, there must be a chitta viprayukta dharma, a dharma, a factor disjoined from thought, that functions to bring all future dharmas or conditioning forces to move into the present and then into the past. Otherwise, they cannot guarantee that dharma necessarily flow from the future to the past. There could be also like from past to the future. Alternatively, if the totality of the 3 time periods at one is collectively regarded as one unconditioned dharma, it cannot explain why there are 3 time periods, which means an unconditioned dharma is not divisible. So therefore, this raises the question of whether such a contention was actually proposed by the early Darshtanikas and Vipajavadins. Interestingly, in the Abhidharma Vipasha Shastra, the 5th century translation of this Vipasha compendium, this specific position was attributed only to the Darshtanikas without reference to the Vipajavadins. It is also interesting to note that according to the Mahavipasha, the proposition of the Darshanika Vipajavadins should predate the Jnana Prasthana, because when the text asks why the Jnana Prasthana speaks of the trichotomy of dharmas as past, present, future, the immediate answer given is to refute the Darshanika Vipajavadins. After that, the text also gives another answer, that is, to refute the delusion that past and future do not exist. So here's the text. But moreover, some are deluded about the 3 time periods themselves, as they negate the existence of past and future, and so on. However, the earliest Chinese translation of the Vipasha Shastra gives only the second reason without mentioning the first. So here, it is to refute the opinion of others who do not acknowledge the existence of the past and future. There's no mention about Darshanika Vipajavadins. Therefore, it is likely that the argument about the Darshanika Vipajavadins was added to the Mahavipasha after the 4th century, probably even after Vasubantu. However, this hypothesis further raises 2 questions. First, even if the attribution to the Darshanika Vipajavadins is incorrect, how should the 2 similes be explained? Then, second question, which is more complicated, how should the related passage in the Gantari manuscript, BL28, be explained? So, regarding the first question, so this is the 2 similes given. So these 2 similes were most likely intended to demonstrate the connection between the term atuan, which means time period or road, and taf, to run or to flow. So in the sense of road, atuan indicates a place where running or traveling occurs. Similarly, in a sense of time periods, atuan indicates the period path where time flows, or more precisely, a time path through which conditioning forces traverse. From this perspective, these 2 similes attempt to illustrate that dharmas enter the present from the future, and then enters the past from the present. It is important to note that the subject in these 2 similes are conditioned dharmas. So this is obviously characterizes the Sarvastivada way of analysis. This is their way of reasoning. Therefore, they could have been spoken of by some historical Sarvastivada Darshanikas. By contrast, in terms of the subject, in terms of the experiencing time, the Vipajavadians inclined to take sentient beings or the experiencer as the subjects. So different mindsets. Since the Vipajavadians view the issue from the perspective of one who experiences the dharmas, what is being experienced must be the present. Nevertheless, for the rigorous Vaibhashikas, these two similes are not ideal or even not valid because they imply a distinction between time periods and conditioning forces. According to the Mahavipasha, as we read, such a differentiation is equivalent to claiming that time periods are permanent. In fact, this contention in the Mahavipasha was probably adopted from the following argument in the Arya Vasumitra Bodhisattva Sangrahita Shastra. So here's my translation. Question: are the time periods and conditioning forces different? Suppose the time periods are different from conditioning forces. The time periods would become constant. Then if time periods themselves are conditioning forces, then those conditioning forces either arise together in one moment or traverse from one time period to another. In this light, the possibility cannot be ruled out that the Darshanika Vipajavadians' idea has two sources. Here, one, the argument that time periods would be permanent on the assumption that time periods are identical to conditioning forces as seen in the Arya Vasumitra Bodhisattva Sangrahita Shastra was mistakenly recognized as a Darshanika view on the time periods, given that this treatise usually follows the opinion of Dharmatrata, Darshanika Padanta. Second, the improper analogies that may lead to misunderstandings about the three time periods were attributed to the Darshanikas, that is, to those known for their use of analogies. In other words, historically, there may indeed have been Darshanikas who employed these similes, but they could never have upheld the view that time periods are permanent. Later editors of the Mahavipasha, or even its Chinese translator Xuanzang, likely noted that this opinion was not maintained by the traditional Darshanikas, and thus called the proponent of the idea Darshanikas who are Vipajavadians. So now let us examine the idea of the existence of the three time periods themselves in the Gantari manuscript BL28. So these factors are included within the 12 sense spheres exist. Then, those factors that belong to the three time periods which are not confused, asampina, should be said to be existence, or else the time periods should be said to be existence. So it is noteworthy that this passage first mentions that those that are included within the 12 sense spheres exist, and then immediately turns to argue that those that belong to the three time periods exist. Such an order of explaining sarvamasti, all exists, is exactly the same as what is seen in Vasubandhu's Abhidhammakosha Bhashya. As I have already argued earlier, the three time periods cannot exist as three types of unconditioned dharmas. Then, is it possible that the three time periods exist as conditioned dharmas, regardless of the Darshanika Vipajavadians' view? From the standpoint of the Sarvastivadians, who define a dharma as a cause, this is also impossible. If three time periods exist as real entities or three types of dharmas, then they must function as distinct causes. However, in that case, future and past periods will become untenable. First, it is unreasonable to claim that a causal factor, a dharma, that is exercising its present activity, kalitra, can make other dharmas remain on the horizon, it means in the future. Likewise, it is equally impossible for such a present dharma to make other dharmas have arisen, means in the past. Moreover, suppose that the three time periods exist as three conditioned dharmas, then each of the three dharmas, present, future, and present, must have its own tritemporal existence. That is to say, there would be a past that has not arisen, means a past which is a dharma in the future. Then a past that is being produced, means a past as a dharma in the present. And then a past that has been produced, a past in the past. So in the same manner, future and present should be likewise. There will be 9 in total. Then each time period as a dharma should have also has its past, present, and future modes. This will result in the mistake of confusion. It's for this reason that BL28, the opponents also state that the past should be said to be past alone, and future and present should be said to be future and present alone. Then, if one asks, is it possible to make time periods as one conditioned dharma, but with 3 modes as past, present, and future? So the answer must be no, because in that case, there would be no need to recognize time periods as a dharma, since the 3 time periods are simply inherent modes of existence in each dharma. It should be noted that in both the Sankiti Pariyaya, one of the earliest Sarvasivada canonical Abhidharma texts, and the Jnana Prasthana, the 3 time periods are explicitly defined as conditioning forces. And all the later Sarvasivadians follow this explanation. It is thus questionable whether the Mahasarvasivada in this, the opponent recorded in BL28, could have ever maintained a distinct opinion even after the composition of the Jnana Prasthana by Katyayaniputra in Gantara. However, BL28 may challenge my above argument concerning the nature of the 3 periods, as it states in here. So, just as for the sake of the determination of the past, the intrinsic nature of pastness, adita tvasvabhava, is established as having existence. In the same way, the intrinsic nature of futureness and the intrinsic nature of presentness are the same. The difficulty in this passage lies in the way that pastness, adita tva, futureness, and presentness are juxtaposed with the term swabhava, giving the expression that the 3 time periods exist as real dharmas. So Professor Cox takes this compound, adita tva swabhava, as an oppositional karmatalaya. However, in my understanding, in Sanskrit grammar, the abstract tva suffix can be regarded as being equivalent to ex bhava. Therefore, adita tva is identical to adita bhava, the mode of past. So the reason for replacing adita bhava with adita tva is probably that it may sound redundant to say adita bhava swabhava. As a matter of fact, as early as in the Sankiti Pariyaya, this adita tva or adita tha, then adita bhava, adita atva, sangrahita, and adita atvan are regarded as synonyms. So therefore, it is legitimate to take adita tva swabhava as a bahuvrihi compound, indicating that dharma, which has the intrinsic nature of the mode of past, means adita tva is equivalent to adita bhava. So in this context, as Professor Cox also remarks that the original function of Sanskrit swabhava in Abhidharma texts, that is to identify the specific property that enables the discrimination of categorical types. So under this interpretation, X swabhava, having X as intrinsic nature, can also be construed as being characterized by X. So accordingly, an alternative understanding of the passage can be tentatively translated as follows. So just as that Dharma characterized by the mode of past has, say, realized or accomplished the existent state or existent mode of past, resulting in the accomplished state of staying, and it's the same as for the past and present. So that is to say, when the staying status of a past dharma is accomplished, then a past dharma is realized. Likewise, when a future or present dharma staying status changes to past, then a past dharma is realized. In this way, this contention also aligns with Dharmatrata's tritemporal theory of the change of mode, the bhava. So therefore, finally, we may come back to Professor Cox's insightful remark on the school identification. So the characterization of the views of a particular school or group, in this case, those of the Darshanikas might not accurately reflect the views of that group. Instead, they might represent the views of another group entirely, or in certain cases, even possibly an abstract position not held by any group at all. In sum, in the Gantari manuscript, BL28, the existence of time periods themselves does not mean the three time periods exist as real entities, dravyatas, in and of themselves. Rather, it appears to support Dharmatrata's theory on the three time periods as different modes, bhava. The attribution of the view that time periods are permanent to the Darshanikas, who are Vipajavadins, should be mistaken. In any case, this Gantari Abhidharma text also shed light on the complexity of the early Sarvasvadins. In closing, I would like to emphasize that Professor Cox's research on Sarvasvada Abhidharma is inseparable for anyone working in this field, and her meticulous analysis of the abstruse Abhidharma text, her careful scrutiny, and her penetrating insights have long inspired scholars. After reading her remarkable new book on the Gantari Abhidharma text, we could understand why she had been relatively quiet in terms of publication in the last 2 decades. But as an Abhidharma researcher who has greatly benefited from reading her work, I am sincerely delighted that her book has been selected for the Numata Book Award. I also hope this recognition sends a clear message to some younger Buddhist scholars, maybe also to institutions, that meaningful scholarship requires patience, the ability to work steadily over the long term, and a commitment to producing substantial and lasting contributions. Thank you.